very little, because as a lawyer, what we would call now human rights lawyer in Russia, he was defending mainly peasants from the injustices of the Tsarist system, and quite often he didn't get paid. He never had any money all his life. When he was at Stanford doing the 3-volume history from all the documents, he had to get a job as a library assistant to pay his way. So he wasn't able to cross the Atlantic very often. He wasn't allowed into this country anyway. He'd been barred out by Lloyd George because of the Kornilov thing. They didn't want any publicity for that, and they still don't. Still an official secret. And so he only came, I can only remember him coming on about 4 occasions. But the last one, I was 16, and although I didn't know anything about Russia, I was able to sort of communicate with him a bit, and I used to read him the newspaper. He was nearly blind in 1917, had cataracts. So I read the Times to him in the morning. He read all the foreign stories. But he wanted to talk in French, but I couldn't do the French. I'd only done 1 year of A-level in French.
What was he like? What were your impressions of him?
He was a very charismatic character. He was known in the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, as Speedy. And he was an enormously dynamic man, even at the age of 80. He had a real presence, commanding presence. And of course, that was why the histories all leave out the business about his successful legal career. And both the Bolsheviks and the British wanted to denigrate him. Well, the way you denigrate someone is you say they're weak. And this thing was put that he was weak. And the other thing that he was criticised for was his emotional speeches. But in Edwardian England, to make an emotional speech in public was seen as a sign of mental illness. And that's what he's been tagged with, but he wasn't like that at all. And he had a very charismatic presence. When he went to speak at the Oxford Union, they compared him to Nye Bevan, the founder of the health service. And he was a great orator. And he was a great orator, but he was also much more than that. I mean, the job he took on with the legal sense was not a job for a weak man.
Well, we'll get to that in a wee moment or two. I know that you were closer to your grandmother, his first wife, Olga. Did she ever talk about what Russia was like before the revolution?
Oh, she's talked about before the revolution.
Yeah, what
father,
did she tell you?
Well, she was an enormously traumatic, difficult woman. She had about 10 or 12 different cases of post-traumatic stress disorder starting from her childhood. And she sometimes wouldn't speak for days. She was really, really viciously cruel to my father. And this didn't come out until after he died. We didn't know it as children. But I was sent in sometimes to chat her up, because she'd landed me with a load of memories, which I can't recall, when I was 6, on what it was like being in the Lubyanka and watching battered faces coming out round the streets and people being turned into ice statues and all that kind of stuff. And I had a nightmare about it. She was very, very difficult.
And so was it the events of the political events and the events of the revolution and her time in the Lubyanka, which I'd like to come back to, but was it those things that had scarred her? Or
well, yes,
it
was living for 3 years in unlit, unheated apartment blocks with no sewage, so that in the spring she had to go out and help everybody shovel it all into wheelbarrows and take it down the river. And just walking about the streets was very, very dangerous.
But did your grandmother ever talk about Russia pre-revolution?
Oh yeah, she did. Yeah, she told me quite a lot. I mean, she came from
was it like?
Quite a distinguished family. It was a lot different to what we think. That my father, he as a boy played in the village with the other village boys. It wasn't this kind of class war thing that going on that some of the Bolsheviks like to suggest. It was open access for university. I mean, if you were a poor village boy and you could find a family who wanted a tutor, you could be through university, no problem. My grandmother qualified as a doctor in 1890, and she died in Siberia in 1937 or 8. And there were all sorts of things like that. Her grandfather was a professor of Chinese. He lived in Beijing, wearing a pigtail for quite a few years, and she had to go and live with him.
But she was from a relatively well-off background. So was your grandfather was as well. He was from a background where they gave a lot of public service.
He was a middle class. He was the colleague and friend of Lenin's father. He wrote Lenin's final school report, in which he said that Lenin was a very, very clever boy, very well brought up, and but unfortunately he didn't have any friends, which was worrying. And when Kazan University tried to deny Lenin his place when his brother had assassinated the Tsar, and my great-grandfather wrote to them and said, "You cannot do this. You cannot do this to this boy. He hasn't done anything wrong. You must let him in." And they did let him in, and this may be the reason why I'm sitting here now, because when they got in the Lubyanka, they were let out. And there's two possibilities. One was that Lenin put in a good word, because he always spoke warmly of his ex-headmaster, and the other was that they were in school with Trotsky's boys, who they got on with quite well. And so there's two possibilities why they were let out, because not many people were.
So Russia wasn't in a great place at this point. There was plenty of scope for a human rights lawyer, and that's what your grandfather was. But Alexander Kerensky was also very active in the Socialist Revolutionary Party. I suppose that meant he was in a very good place after the February Revolution.
Exactly.
Did he talk about his memories?
Not to me.
Tell anybody about them?
Well, I would think he spoke about it quite a lot in America. Nobody over here wanted to know. He became, he got into the Duma in the parliament. They had to buy him a house, the Trudovik party, because you had to have a house. He never lived in it. It was just to give him the property qualification. So he got in there. He was already a member of the Socialist Revolution, so he spent a long time. When he left, he was thrown in prison more straight from university, because he'd made a speech on the stairs at St. Petersburg University, and they went round and searched his house, found a lot of revolutionary pamphlets, and chucked him in jail. And he went on hunger strike. It was a very brave thing to do, because he had TB, and he in May or April-May of 1916, he had a kidney removed, and he had to go through the revolution working 20 hours a day on intravenous morphine, which must have interfered with his moods a bit. So there was a lot of dashing about and a lot of secret meetings. He became a member of the Masons, not the kind of British Masons, but it was a meeting that you could have without the secret police getting in, and you could have women there as well, which I don't think the British Masons do. So it was more or less a secret political organisation.
Alexander Kerensky then became Minister for Justice because he had a background, a legal background. But he also became Minister for War, and he made the decision to take Russia back into the First World War.
He didn't. They weren't out. They weren't out. The troops.
He made the decision to continue fighting then.
Well, but this was the policy of the Soviet. This is one of the big mistakes. This is one of the big lies. That the Soviet were entirely behind what was called revolutionary defensism, something Lenin hated. And so was the British government. They were not two governments. They were in unison on that, because everybody knew that in the First World War, whoever lost was going to get the most monumental thrashing. But this was a falsehood put about by Lenin. The demand was, okay, people wanted peace. People wanted peace in Britain. People wanted peace in Germany. Hindenburg was really terrified that the German people on the home front were completely disillusioned with the war, and would perhaps not stand much more. And so he didn't go back into the war. What he did was he, as all the other generals were trying to do, encouraged the troops to take an interest in fighting. The point about the Tsar is that he destroyed Russia, and he destroyed the army, so that because he'd had spies, German spies, in his palace, one of whom was Rasputin, and that's why the troops were disaffected. They'd been running at German machine guns for 2 years, and they'd had enough of it. And Hindenburg says the Russian soldiers were really brave, and there were piles of Russian dead in front of their trenches, so that they had to bayonet them out the way to get a line of fire. The idea that the Russian troops were cowardly or unwilling to fight is complete nonsense. But they were dispirited by the end of 1916.
Why do you think, then, the provisional government was only in power for, 7 months?
Yeah, 8 really, but yeah, go on.
But it was in turmoil for most of that period. Do you think that it managed to achieve anything in that time?
Well, they saved the Western Front from being swamped by Germans, and if at any time they had failed and Russia had collapsed, as the British ambassador pointed out in February, then we would have lost the war. They have been expected to solve the food problem, to rearrange the land reforms, to invigorate the army and start driving back the Germans to Berlin. Now, even in relative peacetime, a very successful and stable country would have been pushed to do any one of those, and they have been sneered at and laughed at because they didn't do a monumental amount of things. And above all, when the Tsar went, the whole of his administration disappeared with it. So the first thing they had to do in February, March, was to put the administration back in order. Well, actually, quite a lot of the old people came back because they weren't going to be hung for treason or anything, so that was all right. But it took time. You know, you're talking about a country in total turmoil and chaos, and people talk about it as though, you know, a stroll in the park, and well, they couldn't be bothered to do anything about it. It's absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense.
Do you think the February Revolution took a toll on Alexander Kerensky?
Well, I should think he did. He's working for. He had a nervous breakdown at the end because he was on morphine. He was working 20 hours a day, and he was watching Russia, as a result of the betrayal of his allies, slide into the arms of the most amoral, sadistic murderers that has ever been seen in Europe.
One thing that did surprise me was that when your grandfather eventually did come to lead the provisional government, he declared himself the commander-in-chief. He moved into the Winter Palace. He lived in the
It's pretty sensible, isn't it?
The Tsar's apartment.
Well, of course he did.
I just wonder, is that not a wee bit ironic, though? That
where do you think he should have gone? How many offices were there in St. Petersburg at the time stocked with telephones and telegraph machines? You know, where else was he to go? Of course he went there because that was the centre of government.
Did you ever hear about what life was like for them whenever they were living there? Did your grandmother ever tell you about that?
No, she didn't know. She wasn't there. He'd separated from her before that. Mm-hmm. After my father was born, she'd announced that she didn't want any more children, and that was the end of the marriage. So around about 1910, 1911, the marriage was over. They were always fond of each other, but you know, it was just one of those things that didn't work out. And of course, if he had been living with the family in October, they would all have been killed, because you couldn't get away. It would get away with one person in a wig, and so you can't disguise a man and a woman and two children and get away. They would have all been captured.
Let's talk about the October Revolution.
Yeah.
Why do you think it came about? Do you think that your grandfather was possibly naive about the Bolshevik intentions?
I'll tell you who was naive. It was Lloyd George's decision to back the Kornilov rebellion, because Kornilov suggested he was going to send a completely undisciplined troop of hill bandits from Chechnya.
This was a sort of coup d'etat against Kerensky.
into the Soviet and close it down. And then he was going to start shooting disobedient soldiers and factory workers. Now, the death penalty had been abolished in 1864 in Russia, and therefore this was worse oppression than the country had just spent 92 years getting rid of. And there was absolutely no chance whatsoever of it succeeding. But the Allies absolutely would not listen. In September 17th, 1919, somebody got up and asked Lloyd George, why are we not doing more to get rid of these foul Bolsheviks? And he said, well, I'll quote you Disraeli on that. We don't necessarily think it was in the interest of the British Empire to see a strong and successful Russia rolling down to the Indian Ocean. And that explains why they betrayed the provisional government, and it also explains why they betrayed Lawrence of Arabia and took control of the Middle East, with all the wonderful results that we see today.
But your grandfather was in charge of the army at that point, and I know there'd been an attempted coup d'etat, but it didn't succeed. Why do you think the Bolsheviks succeeded where that coup d'etat had failed? Did he trust them?
Because they were unbelievably violent, and they had no moral scruples whatsoever. Trotsky took the telephone exchange out, right? So there was no possibility of communication for the provisional government to anywhere else in Russia. So that was a very clever stroke. But there was no support for the Bolsheviks. After this campaign of promising a peace, Lenin got 25% of the vote, and he closed down the Constituent Assembly, and he enforced his position with the utmost ruthlessness, murderousness and cruelty. When anybody harmed a single hair of a Bolshevik head, they shot hundreds of hostages. They raped lots of women. They raped the women of the political Red Cross, of which my grandmother was secretary, so she knew them. And this has all been covered up. The Winter Palace was captured by a couple of hundred Latvian mercenaries bought with German money, and then all the murder and slaughter and the checker and everything started.
Your grandfather, though, despite all the violence, so your grandfather managed to get away. Do you think that isn't directly linked to the fact that his family had this relationship with Lenin?
No, that's maybe an explanation of why my grandmother and her two sons were allowed to escape. On the night in question, grandfather took a car and rode out to Gatchina, trying to get some troops. He was imprisoned in a castle built by one of the mad Tsars with only one exit, and the Bolsheviks and the Cossacks were arguing with the price of his head when some bloke broke in with a sailor costume, several sizes too small, and he just walked out, and he went to hide in Gatchina forest, and he stayed there. All that stuff is unknown. He couldn't talk about it, because in the same way that he couldn't talk about Lenin and the Bolsheviks in his books, because he had family still in Russia. He was around in Gatchina. He grew a beard. He got on a red wig and a cap, and so he was wandering about. And then he came back to St. Petersburg for the Constituent Assembly. And of course, when the Constituent Assembly met and was dispersed at bayonet point by the Bolsheviks, then he left, and he was got off in a trawler by Robert Bruce Lockhart, who was a British agent, and away to London, where he was thrown out. But he didn't. There was no possibility. I mean, by the time Kornilov had finished, and by the time a few days had gone by, grandfather tried to cover up the Kornilov thing to avoid the thought that the troops had just been betrayed, the revolution had been betrayed by their commander-in-chief. And he felt, and probably correctly, that if they found that out, they would have just, that would be curtains. So he tried to cover up, and in trying to cover it up, he laid himself open to accusations of complicity. There was no way he was going to be complicit with that sort of oppression in Russia. He'd been fighting against it all his life, and he was quite happy to die for it, but he wasn't going to reintroduce Tsarist injustice.
So your grandfather got away.
Yeah.
You mentioned then that your grandmother ended up in the Lubyanka.
Yeah, well, they had a little flat somewhere, and they were searched twice by the checker, and then Granny wasn't allowed to have a job. Nobody would give her a job because of who she was. And just as my cousin Oleg was not allowed to stand in an election for a Labour Party with the name he had in 1950-odd. So she found this, there was stories that were the north of Russia, up towards Murmansk area, Kotlas I think the place was, there was food, because they were living on rotten potatoes and cabbage stalks, which if you were lucky you could fry in a bit of lamp oil. But it was terribly, terribly dangerous. So they had an uncle who was beaten to death in his room by a robber. And you had to, the boys, when they went to the school, they had to go about in groups of 12. And Trotsky's boys had to carry knives. And, well, they felt they did anyway. And it was a very, very terrifying, violent thing. And they were bringing people out on the street in the winter and covering them in water until they turned into ice statues and that sort of stuff. And the Bolsheviks made it very clear, if you met them on the street, that they might let you go this time, but next time there would be absolutely no limit to what they might do to you. And it was a very, very terrifying atmosphere in which to live. So they got away. Unfortunately, on the way up on the riverboat, my granny got involved in an argument with some Bolsheviks. And there were a couple of little circus dwarves who were standing there clapping their hands and cheering her on. Anyway, she was arrested and taken to this bloke who was covered from shoulder to hip in weapons, knives, daggers, revolvers, all sorts of stuff. And he said, "Oh, I think you're wonderful. Why don't you come and be my secretary?" She said, "I'm not going to be your secretary, and you're not going to let me go. I have got to go to where you've been ordered to send it to, or we'll both be dead." So they were taken to the Lubyanka. And they were in a room of maybe 50 women, and every night at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, people would go, be taken out for interrogation, and some of them would come back looking a bit different, and some of them would never be seen again. And they never could remember whether it was 2 weeks or 2 months they were in there, but anyway, eventually they were let out. And then she had what they call this troglodyte existence. There was no running water. On an icy Russian morning, you had to go out to get water from a standpipe. and then carry it up in a saucepan and try not to spill it all on the steps as he went up, and gradually starving. And when it came to it, Dad was dying of jaundice and starvation, so they had to carry him to the train. There was an incident with the papers. Granny was walking down the street, and this guy came on, Sokolov, his name was, I think, and he said, "What are you doing here?" She said, "Well, I can't get away, can I?" Oh, he said, "I'll fix it." So he got her some fake papers, an Estonian passport, and she went to the checker office, and the secretary in the checker office knew her, and said, "Oh, Mrs. Kerensky, what?" Clapped her hand over her mouth, and she shoved the papers in under some other stuff, and they got it all signed, and away they went. And then on the train, the guy coming and inspecting the tickets recognised the pen that she had, and when she asked me back, he said, "I think you'd better keep quiet about that, Mrs. Kerensky." And off they went, and they went to Sweden, and then to London. So
they were the lucky ones.
Absolutely.
To that extent, they got out. What was your grandfather's life like in exile?
His first few years was in Paris, where he ran a magazine. Somebody was sent, allegedly, I'm going to back up with this, Stalin sent somebody to assassinate him. He talked the bloke out of it. And then Hitler came, and he was busy getting Jews away, and sort of more or less got the last car out of Paris and got down to near Biarritz and got a boat, presumably to Portugal or somewhere, and got away. And then his wife then was Australian, and so he went to Australia, and then she died of cancer, and they were now getting up towards the end of the war, and the Hoover Institute bought the entire Bolshevik archive of the provisional government papers because they were desperate for money, and so he spent the next 5 or so years doing that. And he was quite popular in America. He was very well known. In fact, he went on radio a lot. He went on TV quite a bit. And he was given a congressional eulogy of honour when he died. He was one of the very few foreigners to get it. And strangely enough, he was taken in by a Republican senator, and looked after really for the rest of his life. He had an apartment in their big Upper East Side brownstone just near Central Park. And he'd meet groups of Soviet students and debate with them. What
were his views on Stalin and the Cold War and how it developed?
In the war, he made a broadcast from Radio Free Europe saying, "Look, I appreciate what a terrible situation you're in, but you've got to support Stalin until this war is over, and then with a bit of luck, you can get rid of him." Well, there wasn't that much luck going around, but that was his attitude, and he never really talked about. It was just an axiom in our family that all the Warsaw Pact countries were corrupt and incompetent and horrible.
And just from your perception of your grandfather, do you think that he was a man who accepted what had happened to him, or did he kind of lead a life unfulfilled?
No. He was not bitter at all. His line was sort of, as my father put it, you play rough boys in a rough game, you're going to get hurt. That's the score, and you just have to accept it. He obviously was very disappointed in them that they didn't take a political career and carry on the fight, so to speak. There was no chance of it here, and they're still showing fictional material as fact in all the documentaries they ever do about the Russian Revolution.
I wanted to ask you, how do you think history has treated Alexander Kerensky?
Well, with vicious contempt is the best answer I can give you. I mean, if you look in the British Humanities Index, which is a list of all people quoted in all the journal articles published in this country, there are probably over several million on the Russian Revolution, and he's been cited less than 100 times. Yet he had one-to-one interviews which he reported on with key figures in the revolution, and everything that he said has just been ignored. And there's a great success for the British government, great success for the revolutionary left.
Do you think he was written out of history, so to speak, or do you think he was overlooked because it was such a momentous period?
I think he was written out. Even now, there's people. You cannot find a history book in this country or anywhere else, I suspect, that tells the story of the reason for his popularity with the Russian people, that he defended them in the courts against Tsarist injustice and often didn't get paid. You'll not find that anywhere.
So you think history has been unfair to your grandfather?
That's putting it mildly. He was not the kind of man he's portrayed as being. They all just laugh at him and sneer at him and say what a pathetic, useless waste of time he was. And none of them were fit to take his potty out in the morning, quite frankly. You know, that he was a really, really amazing man in his charisma, in his ability, in his understanding of what was wrong with Tsarism and what the people wanted. And that's what stabilized Russia in 1917. That they issued these things: we're going to have full election, we're going to have federal government, we're going to have rights for everybody. And that's all it needed, because then people realised, and the soldiers too, this was not the Tsar's country anymore, this was their country, and they were going to have the say as to how things were done. And that was enough to stop the whole thing exploding.